When Edward returns to his grandfather's land, he finds 96 homes built by strangers. The Whitmore family claims it's theirs, but forged papers and greed hide a dark truth. Edward's fight for justice turns into a war of courage, corruption, and redemption that changes everything. Before we begin, hit subscribe to Black Battles, where every story hits harder than truth itself. 3 years had passed since Edward Heston last set foot on his grandfather's land in the mountains of Colorado. The air there had always felt different, purer, quieter, like it carried the echo of his grandfather's laughter and the whisper of pine trees that had stood for generations. But that morning, as Edward's old pickup truck crawled up the familiar dirt road, a strange unease twisted in his chest. The road looked newer, too smooth. The trees that used to stretch endlessly on both sides had vanished, leaving patches of gravel and piles of lumber in their place. He slowed to a stop. The crunch of tires over the dust was the only sound in the heavy stillness. Edward got out, the wind cutting cold across his face. He looked around, trying to orient himself, to find some remnant of the land he had known. But the wilderness was gone. Where the forest once stood now shimmered rows of Mediterranean-style houses, painted in soft creams and terracottas, complete with tiled roofs and stone fountains. Bright green lawns replaced the wild grass. Streetlights stood where oak trees had once cast shadows. And at the entrance, a large polished sign gleamed. Welcome to Crescent Valley Community, developed by Whitmore Estates. Edward's heart sank. For a long moment he stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. This land had been his inheritance. 47 acres of untouched forest, left to him by his grandfather, Robert Heston, the man who had built his life on that soil since 1971. Edward had promised to protect it, to keep it just as it was. Now the promise lay buried beneath concrete and driveways. He walked further in, his boots crunching against freshly laid pavement. A few people were out, new homeowners perhaps. A woman was unloading groceries from her car. A man was walking his golden retriever, and children rode bikes along the sidewalks. Everyone looked at Edward with quiet curiosity, their gazes lingering a little too long, as though he didn't belong there. Then she appeared. A tall, sharp-faced woman in a navy suit approached him with the kind of confidence that only comes from power. Her name badge caught the sunlight. Catherine Whitmore, HOA president. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone clipped and authoritative. "Can I help you with something?" Edward turned toward her, still stunned by what he was witnessing. "I think there's been a mistake. This is private property, my family's land. I'm looking for the Heston property line." Catherine tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Heston, did you say?" "I think you're mistaken. This land has been developed legally under Crescent Valley's jurisdiction. It was abandoned years ago. We've owned it for quite some time." "Abandoned?" Edward repeated, his voice tightening. "My grandfather built this land from nothing. I've paid every property tax since he passed. There was never a sale, never a notice, nothing." Catherine gave a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, you might want to check the county records again. According to our legal documentation, this property fell under adverse possession. The previous owner failed to occupy or maintain it for several years, which under Colorado law—" "I know the law," Edward cut in, anger rising under his calm tone. "And I've got every receipt, every record to prove ownership." "This was never your land," her smile vanished. "Then I suggest you speak with our legal team," she said sharply. "But I'll have to ask you to leave. We don't allow trespassing here." The word trespassing hit him like a slap. Edward took a slow breath, scanning the manicured lawns, the driveways, the happy families moving into homes built on what once was his forest. The smell of fresh paint and asphalt filled the air where the scent of pine and earth used to be. Catherine crossed her arms. "Sir, I'm serious. Leave the premises now before I call the sheriff." Edward's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. He turned, his eyes drifting toward the hill where his grandfather's cabin once stood. It was gone too, replaced by a large model home with banners fluttering in the wind. "Luxury living begins here, starting at $420,000. He stood there a while longer, the memories flickering in his mind. him and his grandfather chopping wood, fishing in the stream, sitting by the fire as Robert told stories about how hard he'd worked to keep this land safe from greedy hands, and now those hands had taken it. Edward climbed back into his truck, his reflection catching in the rearview mirror, eyes burning with disbelief and quiet rage. As he drove away, the community sign gleamed one last time in his mirror before disappearing around the curve. Crescent Valley, he whispered bitterly. They built a valley of thieves. But deep down a spark lit within him, small, steady, and unyielding. He didn't yet know how, but he was going to take it back. Every acre, every inch, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Edward Heston didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small Denver apartment, the soft glow of the desk lamp flickering over stacks of papers, old tax receipts, property deeds, and his grandfather's handwritten notes. Every page was proof that the land was his. Yet, a multi-million-dollar housing development now stood on it as if his family's legacy had never existed. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He would go back. The sun had barely risen when he arrived again at Crescent Valley. The new community looked even more artificial in daylight, all symmetry and perfection. Every house painted the same 2 shades of beige. The security guard stationed near the gate gave him a long, uncertain look, but didn't stop him. Edward drove straight in, his heart pounding. He parked near the model home, the same spot where his grandfather's cabin once stood, and stepped out. The sound of construction filled the air. A group of workers were setting up fences while a cement truck rumbled nearby. Edward walked closer, watching the men pour concrete over ground that once held his grandfather's vegetable garden. He wanted to shout. He wanted to tell them to stop, but before he could, a familiar voice called from behind. "Back again, Mr. Heston." Edward turned. Catherine Whitmore stood there, wearing the same tailored navy suit as yesterday, her sunglasses reflecting the early light. Her tone was polite, but her eyes carried irritation and something else. A hint of fear. Edward met her gaze. "You didn't answer my question yesterday, Miss Whitmore. What permitted you to build on my land?" Catherine crossed her arms. "I told you. This property was legally acquired through adverse possession. Your so-called ownership expired years ago when you abandoned the land." "I didn't abandon it," Edward said firmly. "I paid taxes every year. I've got the records right here." He held up a folder, the papers trembling slightly in his hand. Catherine's expression didn't change. She took a slow breath, then gave a tight smile. "Then you'll have no problem proving that." In court, Edward stared at her. "So you admit you knew it belonged to someone else?" Catherine's smile faltered just slightly. "I admit nothing," she said quietly. "But I strongly advise you to stop coming here. The homeowners are nervous. You're trespassing on private property." Before Edward could respond, a small group of residents had begun to gather nearby, curious faces watching the exchange. A few whispered, others frowned. A man in a plaid shirt called out, "What's going on?" "Who is this guy?" Catherine turned toward them, her voice suddenly louder. "Just a misunderstanding. This man believes he has a claim here, but it's all been handled legally." The word stung. Handled legally. As if his grandfather's life, his memories, could be erased with a single line of paperwork. Edward stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you even know what this land meant to him? He fought to keep it through recessions, floods, everything. You paved over his home." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Business is business, Mr. Heston. People needed homes. The land was unused and we made it valuable. If you cared that much, maybe you shouldn't have left it to rot." Edward's fists clenched, but he held his composure. "You'll regret saying that," he said quietly, "because I'm going to make sure the world knows what you did." Something flickered in her expression, a moment of unease. But she quickly hid it behind her usual confidence. "You have no case," she said. "And if you keep showing up here, I'll have you arrested." Edward looked past her to the families moving boxes into their new homes. Innocent people with no idea they were part of a lie. A little girl waved at him from a porch, smiling, unaware she was standing on stolen ground. His anger softened for a moment, replaced by something heavier. Sorrow. He turned back to Catherine. "You may have the law twisted in your favor," he said slowly, "but I have something you don't." "Oh?" she asked, crossing her arms again. And what's that? The truth. With that, Edward turned and walked away, the wind lifting dust behind his boots. Catherine watched him go, her confident facade cracking just enough to show a flash of worry. Later that day, in her sleek glass office downtown, she picked up her phone and made a call. "It's him again," she said to the person on the other end. "Heston, he's not backing off. I want his name checked through every county record we can find. If he has anything that can hurt us, make it disappear." There was silence on the line. Then a cold voice replied, "Understood." Meanwhile, Edward sat at a diner on the edge of town, his coffee untouched. He pulled out his grandfather's old envelope and opened it again. Inside was the original deed, stamped and sealed, and a note in Robert Heston's shaky handwriting. "If they ever come for this land, don't fight with anger. Fight with proof." Edward exhaled slowly, folding the paper back into its envelope. He wasn't sure how yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a blur of frustration and sleepless nights. Edward Heston sat surrounded by boxes, some filled with dusty files, others with faint traces of pine needles from his grandfather's old cabin. His small apartment had turned into a paper battlefield, the air thick with the scent of old documents and coffee that had long gone cold. The deeper he dug, the more he realized how much his grandfather, Robert Heston, had loved that land. Receipts dating back to the 1970s, notes written in pencil margins, hand-drawn sketches of boundaries and fence posts. Every page told the same story: ownership, care, and legacy. And yet somehow, the world had decided to forget it. Late one night, as rain drummed softly against the window, Edward opened an old leather folder stamped Heston Property Confidential. Inside were yellowed tax statements, dated signatures, and something else. A sealed envelope, marked in his grandfather's handwriting. "For Edward, if they ever come." His breath caught. Hands trembling, he tore it open. Inside was a letter written in shaky cursive, the ink faded but still readable. "My dear boy, if you're reading this, it means someone has tried to take what we built. Remember, land is more than soil. It's memory. It's family. And some people will destroy both for profit. Keep every record safe. Never sell. Never trust a smiling lawyer who offers you peace for a price. And if they come for it, fight with proof, not anger. Grandpa Robert." Edward sat still for a long time, the words sinking in. His grandfather had seen this coming. Somehow he had known that one day greed would find its way up that mountain. The rain grew heavier. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the cluttered room. Files, receipts, maps scattered like fragments of a broken truth. And in that flash, Edward noticed something strange. One of the folders, marked 1971, County Purchase, had a duplicate deed inside. Two copies nearly identical, except for one difference. The second had a small notation in the lower corner, a faint signature and date added decades later. He held it up to the light. The ink looked newer. Preston Whitmore, it read. His stomach dropped. Preston Whitmore, Catherine's brother. Edward grabbed his phone and searched for the name. The result came fast. Preston Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Estates, and the face of several development projects across Colorado. But what made Edward's pulse quicken was a smaller headline buried under the main results. Whitmore Estates faces fraud allegations in Boulder land acquisition. Case settled quietly. Fraud. He whispered the word aloud, tasting the bitterness of it. He pulled up old emails from county archives, digging through digital records until sunrise. By dawn, he had something close to evidence. A chain of land transfers that never should have happened. Someone somehow had falsified documents under the county clerk's registry, transferring his property to Whitmore Estates through a shell company. Edward leaned back, exhausted, the sun bleeding through the blinds. He had proof, or at least the beginning of it. But proof meant nothing without a plan. He needed someone who could help him fight back, someone who knew the system better than Catherine Whitmore did. That afternoon, Edward drove into downtown Denver, clutching a folder filled with his findings. His destination was a law office he'd found mentioned in an article. Lydia Morgan and Associates. known for dismantling corporate fraud cases and protecting small property owners from real estate corruption. The office was quiet, lined with law books and framed victories. Lydia herself was seated behind a sleek wooden desk, her eyes sharp and observant. "You must be Mr. Heston," she said, standing to shake his hand. "You said it's about stolen land?" Edward nodded and handed her the folder. "It's more than that. It's about a legacy, and fraud buried under concrete." Lydia flipped through the papers, her brow furrowing as she read the letter, the tax receipts, and finally, the falsified deed. "Whitmore Estates," she murmured. "They've been in trouble before. This," she tapped the forged signature, "this could bring them down." Edward exhaled, relief and exhaustion blending together. "Can we stop them?" Lydia looked up, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, but we have to be smart. You can't barge in with anger. They'll bury you in paperwork before you take your second breath. So what do we do?" She leaned forward. "We let them finish the construction. The more they build, the deeper their crime goes. Then we hit them. Not just for the land, but for fraudulent development, tax evasion, and false ownership claims. When the time comes, they'll beg to settle." Edward stared at her, the storm outside beginning to ease. "That's a dangerous game," he said softly. Lydia smiled faintly. "Justice always is." Edward left the office with a strange calmness. The fear was still there, but beneath it burned determination. He now had a plan, a partner, and something stronger than anger: purpose. As he drove back through the city, the rain cleared completely, revealing a pale orange sunset over the horizon. For the first time in days, Edward allowed himself a small smile. The Whitmores had built their empire on lies. Now he was going to tear it down, one truth at a time. Lydia Morgan's office smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, a tidy, business-like scent that made Edward feel both calmer and painfully small. She had closed her door, set a kettle on the weak little hot plate in the corner, and spread his documents across the conference table like a battle map. Outside, Denver's traffic hummed through the late afternoon. Inside, the air was calibrated for strategy. "We don't win fights like this on moral outrage," Lydia said as she tapped a printed deed with a steel pen. "We win them on paperwork, witness testimony, and pressure where it hurts their bottom line." Her voice was precise, almost surgical. "You've got receipts, you've got a forged deed, and you've got a motive. That's 3 threads we can pull." Edward listened, absorbing each syllable. Lydia appointed roles as if preparing for a small war. She would assemble a legal team and file the necessary pre-suit notices. He would document everything at Crescent Valley, time-stamped photos, videos from multiple angles, and notes of any suspicious activity. Lydia recommended a discreet private investigator for background checks on key players, and a forensic accountant to trace money trails that smelled of shell companies and quiet settlements. "Keep your head down," she warned. "Don't talk to anyone from Whitmore Estates without me present. Don't post anything on social media. People like Catherine Whitmore thrive on chaos. We'll create storms that make them flinch, not storms that drown us." Edward left with a small recorder, a list of prioritized tasks, and a new kind of fatigue, less helplessness than responsibility. The first thing he did was return to the ridge with a camera that stamped every image with time and GPS. He started at dawn and worked until the blue hour, taking photos of concrete pours where his orchard had been, of a surveyor's stake hammered beside what used to be his grandfather's favorite pine, of construction crews unloading materials from trucks with Whitmore logos. They weren't subtle. Whitmore's men used language like ownership as they fenced and graded, and the workers shrugged off Edward's questions. But a pattern emerged. Certain subcontractors were the same across multiple Whitmore projects. Contracts routed through a company with no real offices. A series of small consulting fees paid to shell corporations, whose addresses resolved only to mailbox stores. Lydia's forensic accountant, a wiry woman named Ana Reyes, sent the first results that evening, cryptic entries that read like breadcrumbs. Payment here, payoff there, a settlement hush money file in the middle. Not everyone Edward approached was hostile. A middle-aged man named Tom, who installed plumbing at Crescent Valley, slipped Edward a coffee and a furtive confession. "They cut corners to squeeze margins," Tom said, voice low. "And Preston?" He signs and walks away, but sometimes the subs get paid late, sometimes not at all. Tom's eyes darted to the model homes as if afraid the houses themselves were listening. He agreed to testify about cuts and inconsistencies, if called. Word reached Lydia quickly. Whitmore's legal machine had noticed a persistent visitor with a camera. An email arrived that evening, thinly veiled and formally polite, from a prominent firm representing Whitmore Estates. The letter demanded Edward stop what they called harassment, and it requested proof of ownership by a date Lydia knew was meant to corner them into silence. The tactic was textbook. Make the claimant look desperate, then drown them in filings and fees. Lydia smiled in a way that was not pleasant. Good, she said. They've shown themselves. That means they're worried. She filed a limited strategic motion, nothing public yet, that would force Whitmore to disclose certain documents tied to the Crescent Valley acquisition. The motion was surgical. It asked narrow, pointed questions the developers could not answer, without producing the trail out of which they had constructed their empire. But Whitmore responded with pressure. Edward found a notice on his car one morning. A complaint had been filed alleging trespass and intimidation. A security guard followed him at a distance, and someone, he never saw them, took photographs of his apartment exterior. Lydia warned him that the game had turned dark. Whitmore had resources, and resources could be used to intimidate rather than litigate. One night, as Edward left a courthouse hearing, a heavy-set man with a contractor's tan blocked his path in the stairwell. The man's voice was quiet and measured. "You're stirring up trouble, Heston. Walk away. Save yourself." The threat was implicit. When Edward told Lydia, she wrote the man's description down and cross-checked it with surveillance footage from the construction site. The match was unmistakable, a foreman linked to Whitmore contractors. "You'll see more of this," Lydia said. "It's standard, but they overstep, and you call me. Photograph everything. License plates, faces, things you can timestamp. If they think you're afraid, they'll escalate. If they think you're meticulous, they'll miscalculate." All the while, Edward mapped the human side of the story. He met a young couple, new owners, whose mortgage closing had occurred within weeks of them moving in. They believed in the dream sold to them: safe schools, clean streets, a community. They were anxious when he explained there were claims on the land, but mostly they wanted to know whether their lives would be ruined. Edward did not know yet how he would balance his duty to his grandfather's memory with the people living on land he claimed. He only knew this: his fight was no longer private. It was a story threaded into other lives. In the final hours of the week, Lydia sent him an encrypted message. "We're ready to push," it read. "But we need one thing, something that ties Whitmore to the forged deeds beyond a paper trail. If we can connect Preston's signature, the shell company, and an off-site transaction, something that proves intent, the whole edifice collapses." Edward stared at the message, feeling both the weight of the task and the brittle hope that had been growing through the storm. Lydia's plan was poised to pry open a locked box. All they needed was the right key, and somewhere in the quiet hum of Crescent Valley, behind manicured hedges and behind Catherine Whitmore's polite smile, a ledger waited, one misfiled note, one bank memo, one stupid human slip. That would either be the key or the thing that turned them into targets. Edward walked back to his truck beneath a sky bruised with twilight, pockets full of witness names and a head full of strategy. He told himself the truth would out. He also told himself to sleep with one eye open. The lawyer's war was not easy. It was precise, patient, and dangerous. The next morning broke with the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, more like the world was holding its breath. Edward sat in his truck outside the Crescent Valley site, watching bulldozers crawl over what used to be his family's orchard. The engines hummed, the dust rose, and somewhere deep inside him the anger hardened into purpose. Lydia had said they needed proof, something beyond paper trails and whispers. He intended to find it. He started with what little he had, a list of companies linked to Whitmore Estates. Ana Reyes, the forensic accountant, had traced payments to one firm in particular, Golden Gate Consultancy LLC, registered in Delaware, with no physical office, no employees, and a bank account that fed money into Whitmore's trust. was a ghost company, but ghosts always leave shadows. Edward drove downtown to the Denver County Records office, a squat concrete building with flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of mildew. He requested old zoning and ownership files for Crescent Valley, pretending to be a land researcher. The clerk, a bored woman with half-moon glasses, brought out 3 boxes of records. Hours passed as Edward flipped through brittle pages. Deeds, survey maps, payment receipts. Nothing looked criminal, just wrong. Then, at the bottom of a folder, he found it. A signed authorization for land transfer dated 2 weeks before his grandfather's recorded sale. It was impossible. His grandfather had been alive, living on that land, unaware that on paper the deal was already done. The signature, his grandfather's, was shaky but familiar. Yet the date didn't fit. Someone had copied an old signature onto a pre-dated document. He photographed every page, carefully sliding the originals back into place. The next stop was the Denver Land Development Bureau, where he requested related environmental approval files. Most of the documents were digital now, but one clerk, a young man named Aaron, noticed Edward's frustration and leaned over quietly. "Whitmore Estates?" he asked in a hushed tone. "You're not the first person digging into them. You might want to check the archives in the back, paper forms from before they went digital. Sometimes the old approvals tell stories the new files hide." Edward thanked him and went digging again. In a dusty archive cabinet labeled Inactive Files 2010-2015, he found something extraordinary. A thin manila envelope stamped confidential. Inside were scanned pages of correspondence between a Catherine Whitmore and a Preston Whitmore, with notes referencing payments to GG Consultancy. The letters detailed adjustments to property boundaries, shifting lot lines and parcel IDs to accommodate phase growth. One line, handwritten by Catherine, froze him cold. "Make sure the Morgan property clears without a title challenge. If the old man resists, we'll resolve it through documentation." Edward exhaled slowly, his hands trembling. This was it. Direct evidence that Catherine Whitmore had ordered falsification of the title. He texted Lydia immediately. Within minutes, her reply came, "Get out of there. Don't confront anyone. Bring it straight to me. That document is dangerous." But Edward wasn't done. His instincts told him the correspondence hinted at something larger, a financial link. He returned to the construction site at dusk, when the workers had gone home, and walked past the locked trailer that served as Whitmore's mobile office. The lights were off. Through the window, he could see filing cabinets and a glowing security monitor. He circled around and found the side door slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and printer ink. The hum of a refrigerator masked his steps. On the desk lay open ledgers, receipts, and a silver laptop still logged into the Whitmore network. Edward hesitated. He knew this was trespassing. But then he remembered his grandfather's trembling voice the day the eviction notice arrived. He opened the ledger. It was a list of consultant payments, dates, amounts, and initials. He snapped pictures page by page. One entry leapt out. Payment $274, GG Consultancy, $150,000. Land clearance, Morgan Sector, signed P. Whitmore. Edward felt a chill spread through his chest. This was the proof. They had literally bought the crime. He closed the ledger carefully, wiped the desk, and slipped out into the darkness. The next day, he met Lydia in her office. She examined the photos silently, flipping between pages with surgeon-like precision. When she looked up, her expression had changed. More gravity than relief. "This is enough to open a case," she said. "Forgery, fraud, illegal land transfer, and criminal conspiracy. But you need to understand what comes next. They'll fight back, hard." As if on cue, Lydia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "They already know," she murmured. "Whitmore's attorneys just filed an emergency injunction against you for theft of proprietary data." Edward's stomach dropped. "They're framing me." "Exactly," Lydia said. "They're faster than we thought." That evening, a black SUV idled outside Edward's apartment for hours. Someone had scratched the word thief into his truck door. His email is filled with anonymous messages. Drop it or you'll regret it. The intimidation was no longer subtle. Still, Edward refused to back down. He and Lydia arranged a secret meeting with an investigative journalist named Darren Knox. known for exposing corporate corruption. Darren listened, scanned the photos, and whistled low. "If we publish this," he said, "it'll blow up everything Whitmore built. But I'll need absolute proof this ledger isn't fabricated." Edward nodded. "Then we'll get it." The plan was dangerous. They would subpoena the bank records linked to Golden Gate Consultancy. If the payment trail matched the ledger, the Whitmores would have no escape. Late that night, Lydia's phone pinged again. Anna Reyes had found a match, $150,000 wired from Whitmore's trust to Golden Gate, then rerouted to a personal account under Preston Whitmore's name. The final transaction note: property acquisition facilitation. Lydia leaned back, eyes wide. "We have them," she whispered. But Edward's relief was short-lived. A minute later, his phone lit up with a new message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone into that trailer." "We're coming." He stared at the screen, heartbeat loud in the quiet. The war for Crescent Valley had just turned deadly. The night had grown heavy with rain, the kind that washed color out of the world. Edward Morgan sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, every creak of the floorboards making his pulse jump. The anonymous message still glowed on his phone screen. "You shouldn't have gone into that trailer." "We're coming." He'd read it 100 times, searching for meaning between the words. Lydia had warned him this could happen, that when powerful people were cornered, they turned to threats. But this was different. This felt personal. Outside, thunder cracked over Denver. Edward moved to the window, watching headlights flash in the wet street below. The black SUV that had been parked outside for 2 nights was gone. Or maybe it was just waiting around the corner. His phone rang, jolting him. Lydia's voice came fast and firm. "Edward, are you somewhere safe?" "Not really," he admitted. "They know where I live. Pack a bag. Don't stay there tonight. I'll have someone pick you up. We need to lay low until the injunction hearing." But Edward hesitated. "If we disappear, they'll keep building. By the time we come back, Crescent Valley will be gone." Lydia sighed. "And if you don't, you might be gone. Listen to me. Whitmore isn't just money and lawyers. They have people who make problems disappear." Before he could reply, a sharp knock echoed from the door. He froze. The knock came again, louder this time. He glanced through the peephole. 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway. "Mr. Morgan?" one called out. "Denver PD, we need to ask you a few questions." Edward's gut tightened. "What's this about?" "It's regarding a burglary at a construction site on County Route 12. Someone broke into a Whitmore Estates trailer last night. Your truck was seen near the property." He opened the door halfway, heart pounding. "That's absurd." "I was—" The taller officer interrupted. "We're going to need you to come with us, sir." Within minutes, Edward found himself in the back of a squad car, rain streaking the windows as they drove downtown. His mind raced. They were fast, too fast. Someone had reported him almost immediately after he'd left the trailer. This was a setup. At the precinct, he was placed in a gray interview room. A detective entered. A calm, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a badge that read Detective Ramos. He sat across the table, folding his hands. "Mr. Morgan," he began, "you're not under arrest yet, but Whitmore's legal team has accused you of breaking and entering, theft of company property, and data tampering. Care to tell me your side?" Edward stared at the table for a moment, then met the detective's eyes. "Everything I took belongs to me. That land, those files, they prove Whitmore forged documents to steal my grandfather's property." Ramos watched him quietly. "You got proof?" Edward reached into his jacket and slid a USB drive across the table. "Photos, dates, signatures?" "You'll see." Ramos hesitated, then took the drive. He didn't look convinced, but there was something in his expression. A flicker of doubt. "I'll take a look," he said finally. "But if what you're saying is true, you're going up against people with influence. Be careful who you trust." Hours later, Edward was released with a warning. Lydia picked him up from outside the station. She looked exhausted but determined. "They're escalating," she said. "But Ramos, he's clean. He might be the one person in law enforcement who will listen." They drove out of Denver, heading toward a cabin Lydia's firm used for witness protection in ongoing cases. The highway stretched dark and endless, rain misting against the windshield. Edward couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. At the cabin, Ana Reyes was already waiting, her laptop glowing in the dim light. I traced more transactions, she said, spinning the screen toward them. Golden Gate wasn't the only shell company. Whitmore built a web, 6 different firms laundering money from land deals just like yours. Millions, maybe tens of millions. Lydia leaned forward. Can you connect it to Catherine Whitmore personally? Anna nodded. Yes. There's a chain of wire transfers leading directly to her private trust in the Cayman Islands. A silence filled the room. Outside, lightning flared. The truth was bigger and darker than any of them had imagined. But before they could process the discovery, Edward's phone buzzed again. A new message. No words this time, just a photo. It showed his grandfather's old farmhouse engulfed in flames. Edward's breath caught. That's my grandfather's house. They burned it. Lydia snatched the phone, her eyes wide. We need to call the sheriff's office immediately. But Edward was already moving toward the door. No, I'm going there. Edward, stop. That's exactly what they want. Lydia shouted he didn't listen. The drive to Crescent Valley felt endless, his headlights slicing through sheets of rain. When he arrived, the smell of smoke filled the air. The farmhouse was gone. Only charred beams and embers remained. A fire truck idled nearby, its lights flashing weakly in the mist. A firefighter recognized him. Are you the owner? The fire started an hour ago. Could be arson, accelerant traces in the soil. Edward sank to his knees in the mud. The place where his grandfather had planted apple trees was now ash and ruin. Every memory, every piece of family history, erased. And yet in that grief, something inside him crystallized. They could burn the house. They could threaten him. But they couldn't erase the truth. When he returned to the cabin at dawn, Lydia and Anna were waiting. His clothes were soaked, his eyes hollow, but his voice was steady. Tomorrow, he said, we go public. All of it. The ledger, the emails, the money trail. I'll face them in court, in the media, anywhere they want. But I'm done running, Lydia nodded slowly. Then it's war. Edward looked out the window toward the horizon, where smoke still rose faintly in the distance. The storm had passed, but something worse was coming. A reckoning, and this time he would not back down. Morning light broke over Denver like the calm before a hurricane. Edward Morgan stood on the courthouse steps, the same ground where his grandfather had once fought for zoning rights decades ago. Today, it wasn't just about land. It was about justice, legacy, and the truth buried beneath layers of corruption. Reporters swarmed the entrance, microphones flashing, cameras rolling. The media storm had erupted overnight after Lydia Chen released Edward's story to Channel 9 and the Denver Times. The headline blazed across every news outlet. Whitmore's accused of massive land fraud. Local man claims his family's property was stolen and sold. The Whitmore family had denied everything, of course. Catherine and Preston Whitmore arrived with an entourage of lawyers, polished and confident, pretending not to see Edward as they strode past him. Their attorney, Martin Garrison, was a legend in corporate defense. A man who'd buried more scandals than he'd lost cases. But Edward had something they didn't. The truth. And the courage to stand on it. Inside the courtroom, tension hung heavy. The gallery was packed. Families who had bought homes in Crescent Valley, local activists, and news crews all waited for what the media had called the trial of the year. At the plaintiff's table, Edward sat between Lydia and Anna. Lydia's briefcase lay open, filled with color-coded folders and USB drives. Anna's laptop hummed softly, ready to display every shred of evidence. Judge Amelia Rowe entered, her robe crisp, her gaze sharp. "Let's begin," she said simply. The Whitmore's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth and theatrical. "Your Honor, this is a tragic misunderstanding. Morgan, while clearly emotional, has misunderstood the nature of land possession laws. Whitmore Development acquired the Crescent Valley property legally, through adverse possession, after years of abandonment." He turned toward Edward with a smirk. "The defendant was nowhere to be found for nearly 3 years. The land was unused, untended, and unregistered for development. My clients acted within the law." Lydia rose next. Her tone was quiet but steady, the kind that carried truth without needing to shout. "Your Honor, the defendant claims this was legal. But we will show this was not adverse possession. It was fraud, executed through forged deeds, shell companies, and falsified tax documents. We have financial records, digital correspondence, and eyewitness testimony to prove it. The judge nodded. Proceed. For hours, Lydia lay out the evidence piece by piece. Edward watched as the puzzle finally came together. Documents showing how Golden Gate Consultancy funneled millions through fake accounts. Ledgers listing payments marked land clearance Morgan sector. And emails between Catherine and Preston Whitmore discussing how to adjust records to avoid challenges. Each revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. The spectators murmured. Reporters typed furiously. Even Judge Rowe's eyebrows lifted slightly when Lydia displayed the wire transfer linking the Whitmore's trust to offshore accounts. Then came the final piece, the photograph of the forged deed. Dated before Edward's grandfather's death, Lydia placed the original on the evidence stand. This document, she said, bears a signature belonging to Mr. William Morgan. Yet according to state medical records, Mr. Morgan was in hospice care at the time and physically unable to sign. The signature was lifted from an older document and scanned. That is not possession, Your Honor. That is theft, Garrison objected, sputtering about the chain of custody. But the judge silenced him with a look. Overruled. Continue. When Lydia finished, she called Detective Ramos as a witness. He confirmed receiving Edward's USB drive and verified the authenticity of the evidence through police lab forensics. It all checks out, he testified. The ledgers, the payments, the timestamps, nothing's been altered. As the defense scrambled, Preston Whitmore visibly cracked. Sweat beaded his forehead. Catherine whispered harshly to him, but it was too late. Lydia pressed further. Mr. Whitmore, would you like to explain this email? She projected it on the screen, from Preston Whitmore to Catherine Whitmore. Payment cleared. Morgan file handled. No trace left. The courtroom went dead silent. Catherine tried to interject, but Preston blurted out, She told me to do it. Catherine said it was all covered. Gasps rippled through the room. Catherine's composure was shattered. You fool, she hissed. Judge Rowe banged her gavel. Order in the court. By the time closing arguments began, the verdict was all but written in the faces of the jury. Lydia stood tall, her voice calm and resolute. This case isn't just about one man's land. It's about a system that allows greed to masquerade as progress. Edward Morgan honored his grandfather's legacy. The Whitmores tried to erase it for profit. The law exists to protect people like him. And today, that law demands justice. When the jury returned, the air was electric. The foreman stood and read the verdict. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Edward Morgan. We further find the defendants, Catherine and Preston Whitmore, guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of legal documents. Edward exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Lydia squeezed his shoulder, her eyes glistening. The judge ordered all 96 houses and land, titles in Crescent Valley to revert to Edward's ownership and awarded additional damages for emotional distress and legal fees. Reporters flooded him as he stepped outside, but Edward didn't speak. He simply looked toward the horizon, the mountains his grandfather once walked, and smiled faintly. In the weeks that followed, Edward did something no one expected. Instead of selling the houses or evicting the families, he created the William Morgan Community Trust, transferring ownership of every home to the people living there. No mortgages, no rent, no corporate strings. During the dedication ceremony, children played on lawns that had once been part of his grandfather's orchard. Families hugged him, tears in their eyes. Lydia, standing beside him, whispered, You could have kept it all. Edward smiled softly. My grandfather didn't build this land for me. He built it for people who needed a place to belong. I'm just finishing what he started. As the sun dipped behind the Colorado hills, Edward walked to the lone oak tree that had survived the bulldozers. He scattered the last of his grandfather's ashes at its roots, the wind carrying them gently through the grass. He whispered, It's over, Grandpa. We got it back. The breeze stirred, light and peaceful. For the first time, Edward felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The lies, the loss, the fire, all of it had led here. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring what should never have been taken. And as he turned to leave Crescent Valley one last time, the land, reborn and alive again, seemed to whisper back. Final words. Legacies aren't written in land or money. They're written in courage. truth, and the hearts of those who choose to fight for what's right.